you finally climb the mountain when... Long ago, a distant world was obliterated by the spirit of the overworld, and everyone within that world was killed. Or almost everyone, as one being survived that attack. And he, every day since, has craved for the day that he would get revenge on the overworld spirit for destroying his world. And that being was the entity 404. But at that time, long ago, he was just far too weak to get that revenge, as his power had been mostly lost during those attacks. And so it was for that reason that he had spent much of his time hiding in a black box ever since, as that way he could build up his strength, so that when the time came and he was released from that black box, he could attack and kill the overworld spirit. And so by proxy of that, the entire overworld would also be destroyed, as the overworld was tied to that spirit. And so that would mean that if he got his revenge, all villagers, all villagers, everything that you've ever built in the overworld would all be destroyed. However, luckily, he would stay hibernating in that box for centuries, never being able to attack. Well, that was until one winter night when an evil villager opens the box and the entity is set free in the overworld.
Finally, my revenge is now.
And so the entity on that winter night rose to the sky and grew in size so that he was as large as a mountain. And then he began jumping up and down. And so due to his sheer size, every time he landed, he caused the entire overworld to shake and shake, causing mass damage everywhere, which killed millions. And so he kept on doing this over and over and over, causing more and more damage until he was able to draw out his nemesis, as the overworld spirit arrived in the overworld and confronted the entity.
I've had enough of you and your antics. I destroyed your world millions of years ago because you tried to destroy my world and every other world in existence. Yet you live on and try to come back and attack again? Well, I'm not going to let you try again, as now you're going to be banished for all of eternity. And so, no other worlds shall be destroyed by your hands.
And then the entity saw a flash of light, and the overworld spirit had just vanished. This was great, thought the entity. He could continue destroying the world without being stopped by that evil spirit. And so he continued jumping up and down, over and over, causing more and more damage. And he was thinking the entire overworld was going to be destroyed very soon. And so he felt as if he was finally going to get his revenge. But then he looked up at the sky, and something just looked off, as he saw that the sky was fractured. And so it caught his attention so much that he stopped his bombardment of attacks just temporarily and flew up to see what it was. And when he got closer and closer to the fracture, he got angrier and angrier as he realized what it actually was, as that fracture was a portal back to the normal overworld, because he had just been teleported to a mirror world, which was a world that looked the same but was separated and had no inhabitants in it and was worthless. And so he tried running through it to try and get out, but he couldn't, and so he just bounced back. And so he just stood there staring at the portal, angry that he couldn't attack and get his revenge, as mirror banishments tend to be permanent. But just as he was standing there in pure rage, out of nowhere, a pig walks through the portal on the overworld side and falls downwards on the mirror side. Hold on, other entities can go to and from this world, only he can't? That gave him an idea. Maybe, just maybe, he could temporarily give his powers to another entity, and then that entity, if controlled, could go back to the overworld where he could get his revenge, as that other entity could destroy the overworld with his powers. That sounded like it could work. But what entity could he use? So as he was thinking, he looked downwards on the mirror world when he saw the void. That gave him an idea. Maybe he could use the Null, who was already a very powerful being, as he was the embodiment of the literal void. And so perhaps he could give him his powers and just control him. That could very well work. And so the evil entity jumped back down to the surface of the mirror world and ran down to the void, where he began casting a spell into it, just trying to get the Null's attention. And he did that for a few minutes when the Null arrives.
Well, Entity 404, it's been a while, but I have to say, I'm quite...
But before he could finish speaking, the entity lunged at him and began casting another spell to put the Null in a trance. And it worked. The Null was now under his command. He was genuinely surprised that that worked so easily, but he assumed that it must have just been like that because the Null wasn't expecting it. And so it was then, with the Null under his command, that he gave his powers to him and told him what he had to do, step by step.
I understand, my master. I will not fail you.
And so the Null, under the entity's command, jumped up and flew through the portal. And it worked, as he was taken right to the overworld. And so he began on step 1 of the plan. Luckily, this first step was only going to take a few days, and all it involved doing was just the Null staying on the surface of the world so that he could harness the energy of the sun of that world, which would allow him to be strong enough for the brutal attack that he was going to have to undergo. And so it was during those next few days that the Null would just aimlessly wander the world, as he had very rarely been in the surface before, because he spent his life under the voids. And so it was during those few days that he spent his time climbing mountains, playing in flower fields, and swimming in the ocean. It was actually quite fun for the Null to do while he waited. But as this was his first time spending an extended period of time not hiding away in the shadows of the void, the shadow veil that surrounded him began to wear away, which revealed the true colours of the Null, pure white. But regardless of losing that shadowy veil, he was still in his same blocky shape. Also, whilst he was doing this, he was spotted several times by many villagers and illagers, many of whom who took photos of him, as he was staying quite still in the same areas for long enough that they had the time to do so. But none of them would actually go up to this white Null, as they feared that if they touched him, they could die instantly. And those photos would spread rapidly all across the world, as it was just very fascinating to see this strange, blocky creature. And seeing as he was a very similar shape to the mythical Null that many had heard about before, they decided to jokingly call this new white Null creature the Anti-Null. But little would they know, he would soon act in such a way that he was just an inverted void. As it was later that week, during a rainy night, they had finally gained enough energy for his attack. And so he leapt up into the air, going up tens of thousands of blocks, before creating a new void in the sky. And then he began descending, along with his new void, downwards. Now, at first, no one realized that there was a deadly void coming down at them from the sky, that, if it didn't stop, was going to kill them all. But as the Anti-Null continued to descend on the world, along with this void, getting closer and closer to the civilizations, the inhabitants of the overworld began to take note, because the sky had turned pure white and had blocked out the sun and the clouds, and it was getting closer and closer to them. In fact, it was getting so close that some mountains were starting to be consumed. Everyone was terrified, and their screams could be heard all across the world, as many believed that this was it. The sky was falling in, and they were all going to die. And so with all of these screams and fear, that the overworld spirit finally arrived and tried to fix this issue. And at first, he was also shocked, just as the civilizations were, as there is no reason that any voids should be above his world. It's just not possible. And so he tried casting a spell into it, thinking that this void must be some sort of visual illusion. But his spell failed, because this void was no visual illusion. It was another void. This was bad, very bad, as the void was the only thing in the entire Minecraft universe that a spirit cannot stop. And so he did what he thought would save the most amount of people, and that was creating a border ceiling above his world. It was invisible, but it would act just as the bedrock does to stop the normal voids. And luckily, it worked. Well, at first it worked, as it did stop the void descending for a few minutes. But then the void began to push down onto that border, dragging it down the world, which caused even more damage to the mountainous regions. And so it looked like the entire overworld was going to die. The overworld spirit didn't know what to do, as the void was now just a few hundred blocks away, and so at this point, millions were dead, and very soon, everyone else would be too. But just as he felt as if all hope was lost, he spotted what was causing this void, as he spotted the Anti-Null, who was causing all of this. And so the overworld spirit flew up to him and secretly placed a trap underneath his trajectory. And that trap was a portal that would lead him back to the mirror world, where that evil entity was. And the plan worked. The Anti-Null was taken to that other world. And so, before the Anti-Null could come back, the overworld spirit began rising his border once again, and he rose his border up to around 400 meters from the void, as with that distance, the mountains could remain very tall, and life could continue to flourish at almost every elevation. But that was still low enough that the overworld spirit could sustain that border permanently, because through some basic spells, it would now be impossible to break through it or push it down. And so there would no longer be a way that the Anti-Null could push down on his world and destroy it. And so once again, he had been able to save his world. But after finishing this border, he had to warn all other worlds to do something similar, or else they too could become a victim of the Anti-Null's attacks. And so soon, the spirits in worlds all across the Minecraft universe also created these borders. But for a very long time, the illagers and the villagers within the overworld would have no idea about this border even existing within their worlds, as they just believed that the mountains were destroyed on that day because of an awful storm. Also, they never associated that strange Anti-Null being that they saw earlier with any of those events. But eventually, they would discover this border, as eventually some villagers would make the dangerous journey to climb the tallest mountains. And it was when they did that they encountered this border firsthand. And they called this border World Height. But now, back to the Anti-Null. What was he doing? Well, when he was teleported to the mirror world, he continued to descend on the world. And even though the entity saw this and told him to stop, he didn't, as
You ordered me to do this, and I will not fail on the mission that you have ordered me to do.
And so quickly, the entity was consumed by the Anti-Null's void. And so soon, the Anti-Null even reached the main void. And that was when he reverted to his ordinary form of the Null. and was no longer controlled by that entity. But do you know what's all very interesting about this story? It never would have happened if it wasn't for a rabbit. Now, that might sound crazy, but it's true. But to learn how that is, well, you'll need to watch this video.